Today we're going to take a look at the new PAS 2035 regulations and guidance and how that has an impact on your Wave 2.2 applications. So this session really aims to sort of demystify some of the methods within PAS 2035 and help you prepare a really well-scoped and compliant application for Wave 2.2 SHDF funding. So really we can start with looking at what is PAS 2035 and what does PAS stand for. So PAS stands for a publicly available specification, and there are hundreds of different specifications covering a wide range of topics. But PAS 2030 and PAS 2035 are retrofit focused, and there are a couple of others to sort of be aware of. So PAS 2031 manages the process of certification to PAS 2030. PAS 2035 is the British standard for retrofitting of dwellings. So first published in 2019. The standard outlines really how retrofit projects should be managed and delivered. PAS 2030 then is the British standard for the installation, commissioning and handover of energy efficiency measures. And there's also a PAS 2038, which is the British standard for the retrofitting of non-domestic buildings. We'll be looking at that one today. And the purpose really of PAS 2035 is to provide guidance for a holistic approach that considers the building as a system of elements, interfaces and occupants that all interact with each other and they're not standalone. And you might ask, what is the purpose of following PAS 2035? Why do we need to take this approach? And really by conforming to PAS 2035, you really do reduce the long-term risk associated with retrofit. And it's also for a number of funding streams, you need to comply with PAS 2035 to be eligible to receive the funding. So the PAS process, and this image on the slide has been taken from the latest version. So that's the PAS 2035-2023 version. And all buildings follow the main process along the left-hand side. And it all starts with, as a grant recipient, identifying stock that you would like to retrofit and looking at taking into account some preliminary considerations. And appointing a retrofit coordinator really at the inception stage to provide you with some retrofit advice, carry out some assessments to those properties, and that might involve an element of air leakage testing or identification of repair work that might be required prior to any design or recommendation for energy efficiency measures. The retrofit coordinator will then come up with some improvement option evaluations and provide you with further advice. And between you, you will agree some intended outcomes for the project or the properties that you've identified for retrofit. The coordinator will turn that into a medium-term improvement plan before it moves on to the design and specification stage with a retrofit designer, and we'll cover that in a bit more detail in some later slides. Project really then moves on following the design to installation and quality control, and that then touches the PAS 2030 standard before passing back into PAS 2035 for the testing, commissioning, handover and ongoing evaluation. And the next slide shows in a bit more detail how those two different standards interact. So again, this has been taken from the latest PAS 2035-2023 update. And you can see quite clearly that you've got your project inception with your preliminary considerations and retrofit coordinator engagement. And it also, this diagram quite neatly sort of references the different clauses within the new PAS 2035 standard that you can reference and go look at in some more detail. But you can see quite clearly from this diagram that the first sort of 5 steps of the retrofit process all fall into PAS 2035. And then you get to installation and your installers will be following PAS 2030 before it comes back into PAS 2035 for long-term monitoring and evaluation. So I've mentioned PAS 2035-2023 quite a bit there in those first two slides, and we're going to sort of have a look at the summary of changes from the 2019-2022 versions to 2023. So the guidance has been updated to reflect government national policies and emphasise the role of PAS 2035 in protecting the consumer, and that's protecting the consumer against the unintended consequences of poor retrofit, really. The Department for Energy Security and Net Zero have also published a number of retrofit technical guides. So the published guides include internal wall insulation, room in roof insulation, solid floor and suspended floor insulation. So they've now been included in the new PAS 2035 standard as references, where they weren't previously included. There's been a change of emphasis really from a sort of individual measure-based retrofit to whole dwelling retrofit, and that includes more reference to a main contractor. So instead of having individual contractors fitting individual energy efficiency measures, so a heat pump or external wall insulation, there's much more reference being made to a main contractor who may oversee the whole process and consider it from an entire dwelling perspective. The contents of the medium-term improvement plan are now a requirement as part of the new PAS. So before they were guidance, but it's now mandated as a requirement. And there's been a removal of the risk pathways to make the assessment of properties for retrofit much simpler. And the new guidance also provides some more detail and requirements for climate resilience and adaptation in retrofit. A new process has been introduced for the distressed replacement of heating appliances. And what does that actually mean? So it really introduces a process where you can have a boiler replacement. For example, your boiler's broken down, or a property that you look after, the boiler's broken down and you need to replace it pretty quickly. Say it's midwinter. You haven't got the time to get a retrofit quick coordinator on board and try and get all the PAS compliance, retrofit assessments, etc. completed. So it basically says that if your property's earmarked as part of a retrofit project, you can replace that boiler fairly quickly under the new guidance, and then retrospectively come back with your retrofit coordinator, do a full assessment of the property, produce your improvement options evaluation and your medium-term improvement plan, and therefore still be compliant with the PAS 2035 process. There's been some clauses included to facilitate the scale-up of retrofit. So that is allowing the retrofit design to commence based on assessments of archetypes. There's been some clarifications made around the retrofit coordinator role. The simplified assessment has been brought into PAS 2035, as mentioned, and it's the introduction of an independent pre-installation building inspection for all insulation works. Some further changes, so air tightness. So where retrofit designs include building fabric measures, air tightness and air leakage testing strategy is required. So that doesn't mean that you have to have a target, an air tightness target, or actually test, but you certainly need to have a strategy for each individual property. However, if you do set an air tightness target as part of your strategy, then you would need to do an air tightness test of that property at the end to demonstrate compliance. There has been the introduction of some further evaluation for intermediate and advanced M&E works, and requirements and the guidance around moisture in buildings has been brought in line with the language in British Standard 5250. So that's really an overview and a summary of the PAS 2035 changes. Some of them probably sound more complex than they are, but all of this is wrapped up in a transition period. So following discussions between the Department of Energy Security Net Zero, British Standards Industry, and the UK Accreditation Service, or UCAS, a transition period has been agreed to allow time for the industry to adopt these changes, and from 2019 and 2022 versions to the 2023 documents. That transition period has been set for a period of 18 months, during which the existing PAS documents will remain available for use. However, the transition period will end on the 30th of March 2025. So after that date, all retrofit projects must be carried out in accordance with the new 2023 standard. So we mentioned that the risk assessment pathways have been simplified as part of the new PAS standards. So how do you assess risk? Well, each project or each property is assessed in the same way. Under PAS 2035, there's 5 main criteria. And then that basic building assessment is added to by an RD-SAP, SAP or PHPP assessment to come up with an accurate energy model. The air tightness testing, as I've mentioned, is no longer normative as part of that assessment, unless you have incorporated it as part of your strategy and set a target. So what are the implications of those changes? Or what are the implications of this risk assessment? Well, really the risk assessment will define your project requirements, but that has been standardized and is now in line with Plan B from the original PAS 2019 standard. So I can hear you all, if you're not familiar with retrofit or what is risk path B. Well, under the old standards, you had 3 risk pathways, A, B, and C, depending on how complex your retrofit was. Pathway A was just a basic building assessment and nothing else. And pathway B was a basic building assessment plus the more accurate energy model. So in the new standards, every property is now to be assessed as a pathway B. And as I mentioned, air tightness testing is no longer normative as part of that assessment unless you've included it in your strategy. So who carries out the retrofit assessments, or when are they done? So retrofit assessment is carried out once you've done a risk assessment of the property, and they don't need to be completed prior to your funding application. They do have to be conducted by a suitably qualified person, so that would be a retrofit assessor or a retrofit coordinator, and the qualifications for these roles have changed under the new standards. So a retrofit assessor is now a domestic energy assessor, or DEA, exclusively. And for traditional heritage buildings, they must be a DEA with also holding a level 3 award in the energy efficiency and retrofit of traditional buildings, which is the English version. There are Scottish and Welsh equivalents. And the retrofit coordinator must now hold at least a level 5 diploma in retrofit coordination and risk management. And for traditional or heritage buildings, again, they must hold the diploma as well as the level 3 award in energy efficiency and retrofit of traditional buildings. And what impact do these retrofit assessments have? So they help paint an accurate picture of the current property condition. The retrofit designer and coordinator will use them to inform the final retrofit design, and it can alter assumptions made during a desktop exercise. And some of the lessons learned from earlier versions or iterations of SHDF are that the retrofit assessments can sometimes have a lot of changes from your desktop exercise carried out at application stage. So then we move on to, we've done the assessments, we've agreed what measures need to be installed to make the property more energy efficient. We now take a look at retrofit design. So the design requirements in the new regulations now require a complete and detailed design for each of the measures you intend to install. The improvement options evaluation. If it's a traditional heritage building, then you need to have carried out a heritage significance assessment. There should be a ventilation assessment and upgrade, particularly if you're installing measures that impact on ventilation or air tightness, so external wall insulation, room and roof, cavity loft insulation, etc. The medium-term improvement plan, as you mentioned, that's now mandatory and not just guidance. if it's a protected building, and the designs must be in accordance with British Standard 7913. And as we've mentioned, you need that air tightness strategy for any projects where you're going to install measures impacting ventilation or air tightness. Now, who can be a retrofit designer, again, has changed in the new PAS 2035 standards, and it's set out on the slide here. They provided a useful chart with guidance around the qualifications required, depending on how complex your retrofit is going to be. So for a single measure, then you can use an architect, but it could be a specialist designer or specifier for that particular measure or system. So for example, if it's an air source heat pump, it could be a supplier or specifier who's MCS certified, or a chartered building services engineer. For two interacting fabric measures, then again, you can employ the services of an architect to design that, or you can bring in a specialist designer or specifier of the measure under an agreed certified scheme or an industry quality assurance scheme. For two or more non-interacting measures, then again, you can see the common theme running through all of this really is the employment of an architect. But for two or more non-interactive measures, you could also use somebody with the level 5 diploma, retrofit coordination and risk management. For anything that involves system built properties, high rise, or more than 2 fabric measures, so much more complex projects, then it's only an architect that can design those. And then for a traditional building, it needs to be an architect plus a member of a building conservation scheme or the level 3 award in the energy efficiency and retrofit of traditional buildings. So you need to bear that in mind when appointing your retrofit designers to remain compliant with PAS 2035. Depending on the complexity, they need to match these requirements. So what needs to be included in a retrofit design into the new guidance? Well, the retrofit design document needs to include the measure designs, the overall design, and site-specific construction details. There also needs to be ventilation design and or strategy, and that needs to be adequate for the dwelling. And it doesn't just look at the property on its own, it must take into account the occupancy, the proposed design, the current property condition. And when we talk about taking into account the occupancy, obviously the amount of moisture in a property is going to vary between, a single person or a family of 4, how much cooking they do, etc. So that must all be wrapped up in the retrofit design. The intended outcomes, so those have been agreed and set out what the project hopes to achieve. So whether that's to get the EPC to a required level, so from D or E up to C, maybe beyond, or maybe this, you've set a target for a particular level of space heating demand. And then finally, the design document needs to include the risk assessment that defines the project risk. So how does the designer arrive at the final design? And again, under PAS guidance, there's a useful interaction matrix, and that informs the designer if and how different measure types interact with each other. There's a scaled down version of the matrix on the right hand side of the slide there, but typically for green measures, that indicates that they do not interact with each other. If they're highlighted yellow, then they connect physically in some way on the property. If it's orange, they interact in other ways. And if it's red, then those measures are actually incompatible with each other, so they wouldn't be installed together on the property. The measure design, so if we're looking at external wall insulation, for example, then that design might be provided by the system or product supplier with oversight from your retrofit coordinator. It must be produced by a suitably qualified retrofit designer, so the designer would hold the necessary qualifications. And obviously projects with higher risk have much higher requirements. And then construction detailing is really important in PAS. So you might be installing external wall insulation, but the corners, junctions and edges of that EWI must be properly designed to eliminate heat loss through the property and cold bridges. So the junctions and seals are really critical areas when looking at insulation designs and construction detailing. So we've touched on ventilation a little bit earlier, but ventilation design and why is ventilation important? It's really important that pollutants and moisture are removed from the property to maintain good internal air quality. And this is where retrofit can have a real impact on helping you with your mold and damp strategies, really, and helping to eliminate that, because it plays a key part in the PAS 2035 retrofit process. And when designing a ventilation system under retrofit, then the adequacy of the current ventilation system is taken into account. And it's considered inadequate if there's evidence or any evidence of condensation and or mold growth in the property, and that would be identified through the risk assessment. If there's no ventilation system present at all, or it's incomplete, there are no undercuts to internal doors, or if there's no provision of purge ventilation for each of the habitable rooms. Under the ventilation design and strategy, there might be a proposed air tightness value for the property post-works. So if that's designed in as part of your strategy, then again, you need to make sure that air tightness test is carried out at the end to demonstrate compliance. Consideration needs to be made for the long-term property objectives as outlined in your medium-term retrofit plan. And as I've mentioned previously, the occupancy of the property needs to be taken into account. So how might ventilation design affect your projects? Well, any measure that changes the air tightness of the property requires ventilation design to be considered. So examples of that would be EWI, IWI, new windows or doors, floor insulation, installed in isolation, so they will increase the air tightness of the property and require ventilation considerations. And those types of projects are likely to require continuous mechanical extract ventilation in all wet rooms, alongside correctly sized background ventilators in the other living spaces. And cavity fill insulation is likely to require a working intermittent extract ventilation system, and again, suitably sized background ventilators in all living spaces and bedrooms. So we've assessed the properties, we've designed the properties, your installers have been in and installed everything to PAS 2030. Now comes back into the retrofit coordinator to lodge all of those measures with Trustmark to remain compliant with SHDF funding. So the lodgement with Trustmark should include the documentation for all the measures installed, including in guarantee information, claim of compliances from both the retrofit coordinator and the installer. So sign off to say that, yeah, they've been installed and meet those standards. All handover documents, energy performance information, pre and post retrofit works, stock condition information, and the intended outcomes that you set at the start of the project. And just a note here, really, that Trustmark are preparing functionality changes in their retrofit lodgement portal, or the data warehouse, as they call it, to ensure that retrofit projects can be lodged in accordance with the new PAS guidance, and they intend for those works to be completed by April 2024. So some key process principles for PAS 2035. The retrofit coordinator is responsible for going in to the data warehouse and creating a retrofit project on your behalf. The project requires a retrofit assessment, as we've mentioned, and the retrofit assessor would lodge that assessment. The retrofit coordinator can also create that if appropriate. The retrofit assessment should be accompanied with the relevant RDSAP data, but a project ID can then be generated, but there's certain other requirements that must be met. So defects in the property have to be recorded at both the assessment stage and at mid-project stage. Designs must indicate who created them, so there's some ownership, which measures they cover, and what property defects are addressed as part of those measures. The project can be completed and lodged in stages, so you don't have to wait for the retrofit to be complete to lodge everything. As each measure gets completed, it can be lodged. And then finally, to complete a project, the updated RDSAP or EPC must be provided. How do all of these new changes impact your SHDF Wave 2.2 bids, really? And following industry feedback, the department have provided some guidance and have indicated that the Wave 2.2 guidance has now been altered to allow your bid applications to follow either standards. You can follow PAS 2035 2019, or you can follow the new PAS 2035 2023 standard. But please be aware of transitionary arrangements when planning your project. So The transition period, as we've mentioned, to PAS 2035-2023 will end on the 30th of March 2025, after which the British standard industry will withdraw PAS 2035-2019 version. So any work complying with the 2019 version of PAS must be completed by the 30th of March 2025 and lodged in the Trustmark data warehouse no more than 20 working days thereafter. So if you're putting together an application and you anticipate that the work on the properties or your project will continue beyond that cut-off date of the 30th of March 2025, then the department would strongly advise that you use the latest version of PAS, so that's the 2023 version, to avoid any disruption related to the withdrawal of the previous version. And some further clarifications. One of the questions that's being asked is, could a retrofit assessment carried out under PAS 2035-2019 version be used for retrofit carried out in accordance for PAS 2035-2023 version? And the answer to that is no. So requirements for retrofit assessments differ between the two PAS standards, and therefore retrofit assessments done to the 2019 version can only be used for 2019 version projects. Is there a time limit on retrofit assessments? No, there's no time limits for retrofit assessments for SHDF. There are 6-month time limits that were introduced as part of the ECO scheme, so that may be something you're aware of, but that's just due to the specific requirements of the legislation that underpins that ECO scheme, and certainly does not apply to SHDF projects, so that there's no time limit to the retrofit assessments. And then, will options appraisals and medium-term plans developed under the 2019 version be valid under the 2023 version? The 23 version requires every dwelling to have a medium-term improvement plan, and under the Trustmark guidelines, it's the responsibility of the retrofit coordinator to ensure that any existing medium-term improvement plans, including any done under previous iterations of PAS 2035, are reviewed and updated. So they can be used, but the retrofit coordinator that you appoint is responsible for reviewing them and making sure they meet the requirements of the new PAS standards. So due to similarities between the two standards, it's not expected that medium-term improvement plans and improvement option evaluations will need to be completely redone. If they've been done in 2019, it requires a review and possibly an update by the retrofit coordinator. And then just a final note from myself is really that improvement options evaluations might be subject to some change once SAP 10 has been introduced. And that's expected to come into effect from mid-2024. We don't have full details to that at the moment, but just something to bear in mind. And that's the end of, or brings us to the end of the presentation today. So hopefully that's provided some guidance and detail and clarifications around the new PAS 2035 standard and how that impacts your Wave 2.2 applications.